Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 12th session of the virtual Kant Congress. And today we will be in Brazil in a virtual manner. And before announcing the title, I'd like to mention that everyone is kindly invited to switch on their cameras so that everyone can see each other. And I also wanted to remind you that we normally keep open the Zoom session after the formal part. Yeah? So the formal part will be recorded, but after that we'll open the space for informal conversations if you still have time for that. The title of today's session is Kant in Brazil and the Status of Transcendental Idealism. And the host of the session is Georgia Ciacchinato, and I hand over to her for the remainder of the session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Luis Garcia and the entire organizing team for the beautiful idea of this Congress in cosmopolitan Kant spirit and for its successful realization. I therefore proceed to introduce today's two conferees, Joel Klein and Sylvia Altman, and we will still listen to the two presentations and then move on to questions and discussions. Joel Klein is professor of modern philosophy, ethics, and political philosophy at the Federal University of Paraná. He is permanent member of the postgraduate philosophy course at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. He was visiting researcher at the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in München and visiting professor at the Goethe University Frankfurt. He is editor of the review Studia Kantiana, member of the board of the Brazilian Kant Society. He works on themes of epistemology, democracy, philosophy of law, philosophy of history, and theory of justice. Among his publications, I'd like to remember the book Kant e a Ideia de uma História Universal, and many articles published in the main philosophy magazines in Brazil and important international magazines all over the world. He works with themes of epistemology, democracy, philosophy of law, philosophy of history, and theories of justice. He will today speak about Kant in Brazil. And I introduce Sylvia Altman too. She is professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. She is president of the Brazilian Kant Society. She was a CNPq fellow at the LMU in Munich and visiting researcher at the UC Berkeley. Her research interests are in the area of history of philosophy, with emphasis on Kant, and she publishes mainly on the following topics: Kant, judgment, existence, category, modality, freedom, and morality. She currently conducts research on consciousness, transcendental idealism, and empirical realism. Among the latest publication, it is worth remembering the chapter Consciousness as Representation of Representation, Kant on the Human and Animal Capacity for Representation and Consciousness, in the edited book Kant and the Problem of Knowledge, Rethinking the Contemporary World of 2022, and the contribution to the proceeding of the Third International Kant Congress with the title Existence as a Category and the Ontological Argument, the Court of Reason. Then the floor is yours, Joel. Thank you very much, and thank you for all the presence here, all the people that hear us today.
Thank you, Georgia, for your kind words. Thank you also, Karin, Luis, and Andrew for the organizing this very interesting and wonderful event. I have organized a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, because I think is will help to follow. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I took the task to make a kind of overview of Kant in Brazil, which was not an easy task, but because I have to choose what I will have to let aside and what I could pick as a representation of what we are doing here in Brazil. So as a historical beginning, I can it's worth mentioning that there was a very strong influence of the French language and tradition in the interpretation and reading of Kant in the 1960s, in particular at USP, Universidade de São Paulo. At that time, Professor Granger visited USP in the 50s and Gerard Lebrun in the 60s, when he was writing his habilitation thesis at the time, Kant et la fin de la métaphysique. So this was a very important mark in the Brazilian interpretation, the French influence. In 1973, at the height of military dictatorship in Brazil, came out the first partial translation of the Critique of Pure Reason, which was published by Valerio Roden and Udo Moosburger. The volume also contains a complete translation of the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics that were able to come forward as science by Tânia Bertenkopf, the famous translation of the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals by the Portuguese philologist and scholar of literature Paulo Quintela in the 40s, two contributions by Rubens Rodrigues Torres Filho, the first introduction to the critique of power judgment, followed by the analytics of the beautiful and the paragraph 30, dedicated to the doctrine of genius. And at the end of the book, the first part of the religion within the boundaries of mere reason, also translated by Bertenkopf. In 1978, that first volume was divided into two. The first then contained the first complete translation of the Critique of Pure Reason by Valerio Roden and Udo Moosburger, and the second reserved to the other mentioned previous texts. In 1981, Valerio Roden published then his doctoral thesis entitled Interest of Reason and Freedom, which was prefaced by Lebrun. Also in 1981, Ricardo Terra, professor was until recently professor at USP, defended his PhD thesis dissertation, Politics and History in Kantian Philosophy, which was published in 1995 under the title The Tension Politics, Idea and Reality in Kant's Philosophy of History. In 1985, came out the book's Selected Works, organized in a bilingual edition by Emanuel Carneiro Leão, with translations by Raimundo Vir and Floriano Fernandes, containing the two prefaces to the Critique of Pure Reason. Answer to the question was, what is enlightenment? What does it mean to orient oneself in thinking? And on the supposed light for the love of humanity and the end of all things. In 1986, Ricardo Terra translated and organized a commentary on the idea of universal history with a cosmopolitan aim, with essays in this book by Ricardo Terra, Gianotti, and also Gerard Lebrun. In 1992, Guido de Almeida published the translation of Kant's Logic. In 1988, was the first Kant Congress took place in Brazil, organized by Jelico Loparich, professor at Unicamp and former student of Heidegger, which culminated in the foundation of the Brazilian Kant Society, with Loparich as its first president. The next two congresses, 200 Years of the Metaphysics of Morals in 1997 and Kantian Perspectives in the 21st Century in 21, took place in Itatiaia, organized by Guido Antonio de Almeida, with the support of the SKB, whose president at the time was Valério Roden. In 92, Valério Roden and Antonio Marques published the first Portuguese translation of the Critique of the Power of Judgment. In 93, appeared the book Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime, and the Essay on Mental Illness, translated by Vinícius Belendes de Figueiredo. And in 2002, Valério Roden published his translation of the Critique of Practical Reason. The Studia Kantiana was founded in the Journal of Brazilian Kant Society was founded in 1998 and was initially published annually. From 2012, it was published every 6 months, and from 2016, it became published quarterly. The journal currently also is linked to the journal portal of the Federal University of Paraná and has published 42 volumes to date. The first one was published printed, and now on the journal is only published in a virtual manner, and is free access. In 2002, Jellico Loparic founded the journal Kant e Prints, which was associated with the Campinas section of the Brazilian Kant Society and the Center of Logic of the State of University of Campinas. The journal has published more than 50 volumes until now. In 2024, a group of professors and former students associated with the Transcendental Semantics Research Group founded by Loparic organized the 21 Kant Colloquium. So it's a very long tradition of events and a journal dedicated to that was grown around this research group founded by Loparic. In 2005, the colloquium International Kant Congress Recht und Frieden was in der Philosophie Kant was hosted by the SKB and the University of São Paulo, and was organized in the volumes the Acton as in the Walter de Gruyter publisher. In 2008 took place the fourth Congress of the Brazilian Kant Society that took place at PUC Rio Grande do Sul and Goethe Institute. It was organized then by Christian Ham, Federal Santa Maria, and Ricardo Terra, USP. In 2013, there was the fifth Congress of Brazilian Kant Society at Federal University of Santa Catarina, and was organized then by Alessandro Pinzani and Christian Ham. The sixth took place in 2018 and was held in the University of Campinas and organized by Monique Hulshoff, Unicamp, and Maria Borges Ufsky, Federal Santa Catarina. In 2024, this year, we have our seventh Kant Congress, which also took place in the University of Campinas and was organized by Monique Hulshoff and Silvia Altman, among others. In 2005, the Center of Kantian Investigation was created at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, which has already organized seven national events on Kant. Linked to the center is a virtual publishing house, NEFIP Online, that since 2012 has been publishing commentaries on Kant's work online and with free access. So these are some of the books published on Kant from this time, and they are related to this Center of Kantian Investigations. In the first decade of the 21st century, some other translations of Kant's work appear in Brazil. These include in 2005, the Pre-Critical Writings, a collection that brings together several works such as Investigation into the Evidence of the Principle of Natural Theology and Morality, translated by Luciano Codato, The Form and Principles of the Sensible World and the Intelligible World, better known as the Dissertations of the 70, translated by Paulo Licht dos Santos, and Dreams of a Visionary, explained by Dreams of Metaphysics, by Joãozinho Beckenkamp. In 2006, was translated the Anthropology from a Pragmatical Point of View by Clélia Martins. And in 2009, The Groundwork of Metaphysical of Morals as a bilingual work by Guido Antônio de Almeida. In 2012 came out a selection of some papers written by Brazilian Kant scholars organized by Friedrich Rauscher and Daniel Pérez. Kant in Brazil is a collected volume of essays conceived at the 2005 International Kant Congress in São Paulo as a way to make accessible to Anglophone Kant scholars some of the best work on Kant produced by Brazilian scholars. The aim of the book is enable Anglophone readers worldwide to incorporate the previous and neglected work to their own debates about Kant. In 2013, Ubirajara Marques founded the journal Estudios Kantianos, which is associated with the State University of Marília. To date, the journal has published 23 volumes on Kant. So in Brazil, we have 3 journals only dedicated to Kant research. Since 2004, the Marília Kant Colloquia has been held regularly. Also was founded by Ubirajara Marques. Started by Marques. And since 2013, it has been renamed the Clélia Martins Colloquium in honor of a Kantian colleague from Marília who died in 2014. There have been more than 10 editions of the event, with the 11th scheduled for November of 2024. In 2009, Ubirajara Marques, together with Portuguese and Italian colleagues, took the initiative to create the multilateral Kant Colloquium, which has already taken place in Lisboa, 2009, Mainz, 2011, Tiradentes, Brazil, in 2013. It was then organized by Patrícia Cauart Leite, Jorge Cecchinato, Virginia Figueiredo, Margaret Ruffin, and also Ubirajara. Then in Madrid, 2014, New York, 16, Halle, 17, Catania, 18, Lisbon, 21, Parma and Ferrara last year. And the next one is scheduled in Florianópolis, Brazil from 29th September to 3 of October from next year, 2025. The call for papers will be published soon and will be entitled the 11th Multilateral Kant Colloquium, Enlightenment, Science and Ethics, and will be chaired by Maria Borges, Federal Santa Catarina, and by myself. And all are invited to submit a proposal to this very already with the traditional Kant event. In 2015, the publishing house Vozes became a new series of translation of Kant's work. The goal is to have all of Kant's published works in the collection by 2030. So it's a very ambitious project that it's currently underway. Now we have the full translation of the religion in the limits of mere reason, for example, and other lections of Kant in the doctrine of religion, and so forth. The history of Brazilian, the Sociedade Kantiana Brasileira presidents. The first president was Gélico Loparic from 89 to 94. Then Valério Roden, at that time at the Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, from 94 to 2006. Ricardo Ribeiro Terra, USP, from 2006 to 2010. Ubirajara Azevedo Marques, Marília, 2010 to 14. Then Maria de Lourdes Alves Borges, Federal Santa Catarina, from 2015 to 21. And now Silvia Altman from 2022 to current date, from Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. Well, there is no detailed research on the influence of Kant's philosophy on the national scene. But to get an idea of the influence, we can mention the data provided in the paper written last year by Figueiredo, Vinicius, Thiago Zucchi, Lorena Marques, and Egile Lopes and André Penteado, which is entitled 50 Years of Master's Thesis and PhD Dissertations on the Critique of the Judgment in National University Philosophy. from 1971 to 2021. Was published in Studia Kantiana. Well, from 71 to 21, it has been defended 57 master's theses and 29 PhD dissertations, only in the critique of judgment. From these numbers, we know that 66 were defended by men and 20 by women. 67 dissertations were supervised by men compared to 19 supervised by women. In this case, the two pioneers' defenses were the PhD dissertation by Rosa Gabriela de Castro Gonçalves, supervised by Maria Lúcia Cacciola at USP, and the master's dissertation of Arthur Chagas, supervised by Virginia Araújo de Figueiredo at Federal of Minas Gerais, both dated from 2006. It should be noted that from 71 to 2002, a total of 17 defense, 14 works on the third critique were supervised by supervisors who had not defended either their master or their PhD on Kant. This is an indicator that until recently, specialization was not the rule in the field of philosophy production at national universities. Well, although the Brazilian context is still quite unequal from a gender point of view, it is worth noting that Brazilian female Kantian philosophers have left a significant mark on the national and international Kant scene. In this case, I would like to mention, among others, the books of Patrícia Kauak, Théorie quantique et philosophie transcendentale, Diálogos Possíveis, from 2012, and it was translated into Portuguese in 2022. The other books by Virginia de Figueiredo, Horizons of Beautiful, Essays on Kant's Aesthetic, from 2017, and Maria Borges, Emotion, Reason and Action in Kant, published by Bloomsbury in 2019. Well, I hope that this presentation, despite the fact that many important scholars, events, and books have not been mentioned due to the lack of time or fear of myself of giving too much information, for which I apologize, I hope that it is sufficient to provide an overview of the recent history of Kant's research and teaching in Brazil. Part of this presentation was based on a paper by Monique Hulshoff, which reconstructs the reception of Kant in Brazil through the route of translations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joel. I give the word to Sylvia. We will have our discussion after the paper of Sylvia. Sylvia, the floor is yours. I just remember the title of your paper, that is Empirical Realism in Transcendental Idealism.
Thank you. Are you listening? Is it okay, the sound? Okay,
yes.
Thank you. So thank you, Georgia, for the introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank and congratulate Karin, Andrew, and Luis Felipe for the wonderful organization of this series of conferences. It's been really a privilege to listen, to be there, or at least listen afterwards. And I think the title was the title of the Congress, With a Cosmopolitan Purpose, was very thoughtful, and the results are serving that purpose. I think so. Thank you very much. I think it's really a nice idea, and I know it's a lot of work, and we all thank you very much. I changed slightly the title of my talk, but the idea is basically the same. You'll understand why is not. No, I have to. How do I move it? No, now it worked. Okay, so what I just wait a minute. Just I'm sorry, because I got something wrong here. No. And what I would like to, I would just like to make a quick observation on what I will present, why I chose this. There are two reasons why I chose to present this topic. And the first one has to do with it kind of fits with what Joel presented. I think you must have seen how, in a sense, how recent the studies in content translations they are. They started like in the 70s, so that's not such a long time ago. And actually, graduate programs in Brazil, like the national system of graduate programs, was created by the generation just before us, by this generation of Guido de Almeida, Jerico Lopari, Ricardo Terra. So in a sense, it's very recent and very intense, incredibly intense. Although Brazil is a big country, and and part of it, and part of what would like to say is thanks to this generation, which created graduate programs in Brazil and which gave us the opportunity to study and to learn philosophy and discuss. And well, nowadays things have changed, especially some things have changed, some things have changed, others not. But I think it's important to take into account that there are some specificities of working in a third world country. I mean, we don't have, I don't think in Brazil we have in general the same level of good formation in the equivalent of high school and so on. We don't have the same amount of reading. Our students don't. We didn't when we were students. Nowadays we have access to bibliography thanks to internet, but when we were students we didn't, so it was very hard to get copies. So we had limitations. We still have some limitations in language and everything. And I think what this generation just above us gave us was the best they could, in the sense of really caring about the texts as much as we could, and trying to understand what it means, like knowing the best we could the texts, the Kantian texts and secondary bibliography, national and international, and also trying to really understand and put different authors in dialogue with different theses. And I think this was done by many, but I would like to start mentioning here. I would use, I've not discussed, but I will use to present the problem two wonderful papers, one in Portuguese, and the Portuguese one is a version of the one published in German about the refutation of Kant's refutation of idealism. So I owe a lot to many professors, but among them much to Guido de Almeida, and so I wanted to start with that, and also mention how I will just mention. Among many other Brazilian scholars, younger, Pedro Rego, Hans Christian Klotz, Andrea Fajon, those are people who have been talking together and meeting when we can. And this possibility was given by this generation. So I wanted to register this thank and start with the problem. So I would, as I said, I will not focus on the problem, but I would on the text and not discuss Guido de Almeida's text, but I would like to start to use it to present the problem. Now my question would be this. Well, given the well-known distinction between things that exist outside us in an empirical sense and in a transcendental sense, I won't go back to that. I think everyone knows that. Should we or should we not accept that in order for Kant to claim to be a realist, it is necessary to prove more than the existence of something external? Now, the question is especially difficult if we want Kant to be placed in dialogue with non-Kantian positions. Now, along with several other authors and with a sophistication and richness exemplary, Guido de Almeida maintains in this text that I mentioned here that Kant needs to prove more than the existence of something empirically external, and that the argument of the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, entitled Refutation of Idealism, intends to do so. So I'll not discuss his paper, but even though I find it remarkable, and I'm not convinced that this needs to be done. And what I would like to do here is try to present alternative, try a different answer to the problem in question, to this question there. And I would like to use now another colleague, the formulation another colleague presents in order to present two possible positions and say why I'll try to present a third one. Now, Pedro Rego, which is a colleague from Rio de Janeiro, he divides...
aqui nessa sala.
Hello? Oh, sorry. No. He tries to divides the positions we could have regarding the Kant's refutation of idealism into two main streams with many differences among them, but the one he calls phenomenism or phenomenalism, I don't know how exactly you would translate, which would be an interpretive line of the Kantian refutation of idealism, for which refuting idealism means exclusively proving that objective phenomenal representations exist in objective space. And another main trend, which would be which he proposed to label realistic idealism, which would be a reading that sees at some point in Kant's refutational project the conviction that one can only really refute a Cartesian material idealist by proving that all phenomenal and representational externality rests on the basis of an extra representational effective existence. Which, according, now I'm not quoting, but it is clear from Pedro Rego's text that would, according to him, depend on the proof of something extra representational in a transcendental sense. So those would be. What I would like to propose, and that's why I changed slightly the title, what I'd like to discuss is the suggestion that we should perhaps label Kant's position as an idealist realism. And why this change? Why not realistic idealism? Why would I prefer idealistic realism? Because it seems to me that realistic idealism suggests that Kant is first and foremost an idealist, but then he's an idealist of a special kind, and you have to modulate his idealism by saying that he's a realistic idealism. Whereas I would like to suggest otherwise, other than verse, that in a sense, Kant is essentially a realist, but is a kind of realism that is idealistic, and that's what I'll try. That's what I'll try to explain. Now, first, I like to just say that I'll make two assumptions here, and the first one is the second reason why I chose this topic, because in a Living Congress some years ago, a wonderfully organized online event also, from which I profited a lot as the others, I presented something on the fourth paralogism, on the Kant's critique of the fourth paralogism in the first edition. So this is kind of a follow-up to that event. So that was the second reason also to thank you for that occasion and this occasion now. And so that was the second reason for choosing this topic. And then, so I'll just say what I tried to defend there, and I will assume that here, and I'll also say what I'll assume about the refutation of idealism in the B deduction. Okay, so the reconstruction I made of Kant's critique of the fourth paralogism in the first edition sought to show that the Kantian argument in the critique of the fourth paralogism in the first edition should not be read as an attempt to prove the certainty of the existence of external objects. I try to argue in favor of the reading according to which the purpose of the critique of the fourth paralogism is more modest than that of a refutation of idealism, that Kant's intention was only to refute a specific ground offered for the impossibility of demonstrating the existence of empirically outer objects. Namely, it aimed at contesting a certain asymmetry between our access to ourselves as an object of inner sense and to objects of outer sense. So that was all Kant was trying to do, I think, there. And this point is important for me to recall here, because if that reading is correct, it means that Kant never intended the transcendental inner character of objects in space to be the fundamental and sufficient basis for distinguishing him from a material idealism. And so I think we have to resist that, to think that the sole basis or the main basis for Kant claiming to be a realist would be the transcendental inner character of objects of space. So I'll assume that. I won't go into that here, but accepting that, what would then be the basis on which Kant wants to distinguish himself from what he calls a material idealist? Now, I would like to argue here that part of the answer isn't something that was assumed, that Kant assumed in the first edition of the first critique, and that was only explicitly addressed in the second edition, namely the dependence of inner sense on outer sense. And so what I suggest is that the introduction of the refutation of idealism in the B edition intends to prove only that inner sense depends on outer sense. Now, as evidence that this dependence was assumed in the first edition, we have, for example, that Kant makes statements like this in the critique of the fourth paralogism without the slightest attempt to justify these claims. So I'll just read the quotes. This material or real entity, however, this something that is not, that there is to be into it in space, necessarily presupposes perception, and it cannot be invented by any power of imagination or produced independently of perception, which indicates the reality of something in space. And then, second one, in order to refute empirical idealism, it is likewise sufficient to it is like, in order to, sorry, the quote is bad, but anyway, it is likewise sufficient that without perception, even fictions and dreams are not possible. So our outer senses, as regards the data from experience can arise, have actual corresponding objects in space. Now, those are claims he makes without any attempt of justification. And as I said, I think that's the kind of concern that he that's the kind of thing he's concerned with when writing the refutation of idealism. And then, so I go to make explicit my second assumption, is that even without trying to reconstruct and justify a reading of the section of the section refutation of idealism, I would like to take into account to take these formulations. If we take the first formulation of the refutation of idealism, we have the representation of something persisting in existence is not the same as a persisting representation. For that can be quite variable and changeable, as all our representations are, even the representations of matter, while still being related to something permanent, which it must therefore be a thing distinct from my representations and external. Now, what I would like to point out is that this formulation, it is perfectly compatible with the fact that it is always about showing the existence of something distinct from my representations in an empirical sense. That is, the dependence of inner sense on outer sense, and therefore on something spatial. And if it is spatial, it's phenomenal, it's not transcendentally outer. Now, the persistent would be always something in space, and as such, transcendental inner. But I'll try to explain. I will assume that that's all Kant is doing here, and I'll focus on trying to say how can that be a refutation of idealism. If we take the formulation of the theorem, again, we have the mere but empirically determined consciousness of my existence proves the existence of objects in space outside me. We'll say that is, it's always about objects in space, and therefore something phenomenal. Okay, so I'll assume, of course, much would have to be argued to say that the refutation of idealism could not be read otherwise. Especially, I would have to answer Guido's concern, but for my purpose here, I'll just assume that. And then if we take that, then we have the following problem, the problem of how is this a refutation of putting together the two things, that is, that all that is proven is that inner sense depend on outer sense, and whatever is in objects of outer sense are transcendentally inner. How could that be proper refutation of idealism in a relevant sense? And I will use Kant's own formulation when addressing this problem in the Prolegomena. I'll just read. Idealism consists in the claim that there are none other than thinking beings, and I would like to have you keep in mind this formulation. There are none other than thinking beings. The other things that we believe, we perceive, and intuition are only representation in thinking beings, to which in fact no object existing outside these beings correspond. So this is what Kant calls idealism, and I'll come back to this definition afterwards. And then he has the surprising surprise. He manifests the surprising surprise. I by all means avow that there are bodies outside us, that is, things which though completely unknown to us as to what they may be in themselves, we know through the representations which their influence on our sensibility provides for us, and to which we give the name of a body, which word, therefore, merely signifies the appearance of this object that is unknown to us, but is nonetheless real. Can this be called real idealism? It is the very opposite of it. Now, my problem is that I think it doesn't seem obvious that that's the opposite of idealism. That's why Kant surprise. Now, Kant concedes that only phenomena, not transcendentally external things, can be the object of immediate perception, never anything transcendentally external. So, should we accept that existence of something transcendently external is doubtful? If so, how can we conclude that Kant is here saying that it is ultimately not conclude that he's saying that it's ultimately possible that perhaps all that exists are the subject and its representations? A typical way of putting reasons for resisting that proving something empirically external is sufficient to refute idealism would be to say that this proof is compatible with something like, from the transcendental point of view or from the point of view of things in themselves, it may well be that after all, there's nothing external, transcendentally external to me. So that's the difficulty I would like to address, assuming what I said I would assume about the two first point. And the first quote I would like to use two supports in presenting my suggestion for discussion. The first one is a reflection that is usually appealed to when people want to insist that Kant came to recognize the need to prove the existence of something transcendentally external in order to be a realist. Is this reflection? Some problems of translation, but I'll just read as it is in the Cambridge translation. Also, the idea of the persistence must go to that which contains the ground of the determination of time, but not with respect to succession, for in this there is no persistence. Consequently, only in that which is simultaneous must the persistent lie, or in the intelligible, which contains the ground of the phenomena. Now, I'll come back later to this quote. It's obvious why it can be used to say that Kant recognized the necessity to prove the existence of something external in a non-empirical sense, because it talks about the intelligible and ground of the phenomena. But I will come back to this passage later, taking into account something that Kant does in the Prolegomena also, that is, insisting that the object of inner sense is an appearance also. I'll just read this quote. I'll go back to it later too. I mean, I am, by means of outer appearances, just as conscious of the reality of body as outer appearances in space, as I am, by means of inner sense, conscious of the existence of my soul in time, which soul I cognize only as an object of inner sense through the appearances constituting inner state, and whose being, as it is in itself, which underlies these appearances, is unknown to me. Now, what I would like to recall is that at least from a theoretical point of view, I, or myself as a thinking being or as a subject of representations, am an object of inner sense. And what I would like to suggest is that given the Kantian characterization of a thinking being as the object of the determinations of inner sense, and accepting the dependence of inner sense on representation of outer sense, I think those two things put together, the assumption that all that exists are thinking beings seems absurd to me. It is absurd because we don't even have a meaning that could give us a use to the term thinking being if we abstract from inner sense, at least from a theoretical point of view. Accepting the criticism of the paralogisms in general, we could not characterize what we mean by that, by a thinking being in itself. I, from a theoretical point of view, have access, can know myself only as an object of inner sense, and therefore as a phenomenon. And since this phenomenon of inner sense, if Kant has proven in the refutation of idealism that it depends on a phenomenon of outer sense, it would be inconceivable, the formulation of the idea all that exists are thinking beings and this being's determinations. Okay, but of course, it is possible that everything that exists in itself is the ground of the I, which is also the transcendental ground of bodies. But this transcendental ground is not the thinking I, at least not, as you know, through theoretical reason. The thinking I is a phenomena of this transcendental ground. So the difficulty pointed out above about how to explain Kant's claim that all existence that can be proved to be distinct from us is that of what is distinct in an empirical sense, and that is outside of us in an empirical sense is also a mere representation. And the difficulty of sustaining that, and at the same time not wanting to be identified with an idealist who claimed that perhaps all that exists are thinking beings and their representations, was, as I already mentioned, and I'll go back now to the second quote. I'll put together, okay, here. Now, what I'd like to point out, I'll go back, that in the prolegomena, we have, I won't read the two quotes again, not to make too long, because I have already read them. But what we have is that the passages combined insistence on the reality, existence of this ground that appears to us as bodies, with the reiteration of the claim that we know nothing of the things in themselves that appears to us as body. And at the same time, Kant makes the same point about the object of inner sense. I mean, the same holds. I don't know what is the ground of the ground of what appears to me as an object of inner sense. I have absolutely no access of that, except only that it exists. Thus, we find in this text, I think, a basis for sustaining the position according to which, although we cannot speak of a distinction between two things in themselves, one thing the transcendental ground of ourselves and another thing the transcendental ground of bodies, because you know absolutely nothing about the transcendental ground, we must distinguish two types of phenomena, I as a thinking being and bodies. And more important for my point here, we must distinguish I as a thinking being from the transcendental ground that can appear phenomenally as a thinking being or as bodies. So, faced with the question, but isn't it possible that all that exists are thinking beings and their representations? I think Kant's answer would be no, since thinking beings, at least as we know them through theoretical reasons, are the appearance of an unknown ground, and an appearance of an unknown ground that depends on the appearance of an unknown ground as bodies, because inner sense depends on outer sense. We cannot know anything about this intelligible ground of bodies and not thinking beings, but assumption that there are only thinking beings and not bodies would be absurd for Kant. Thinking beings as we know them. So as a final step, or next to final step, I'll go back to that, to how with that I would read this reflection I mentioned earlier. I mean, the passage says that persistence must be due or rest or refer in something that is simultaneous or in the intelligible, and thus, as I said, suggesting that the permanent is not only external in an empirical sense, but in an intelligible or transcendental sense. However, should we or could we even read intelligible as the same as being in the intelligible, as being in something transcendentally external? I don't think it is possible, because persistence and simultaneity cannot apply to things in themselves. They cannot be properties of things in themselves, considered, at least simultaneity and persistence, they are in themselves. But time can be said to be the mode of appearance of an intelligible ground. So perhaps all Kant is saying in this reflection is simply that it is not possible for everything to be a representation of inner sense, but that there must be an intelligible ground, irreducible to the empirically internal, something that is neither empirically inner nor empirically outer. But we can say nothing of this ground, of the empirically inner. We cannot say that it is transcendental or distinct from the intelligible ground of the empirically inner. All we can say is that we cannot stay only with inner sense and outer sense. We have to have an intelligible ground, which is a known. And this would be compatible with the last quote I'd like to make. It's a long quote, but it's out from Kant's critique of the fourth paralogism, when he answers to dogmatism and materialism. So sorry for the long quote, but now, if one asks whether dualism alone holds in the doctrine of the soul, then the answer is, of course, but only in the empirical sense. That is, in the connection of experience, matter as substance in appearance is really given to outer sense, just as the thinking eye is given to inner sense, likewise as substance in appearance. And in the connection of our outer as well as our inner perceptions, appearances on both sides must be connected among themselves into one experience according to rules that a category of substance brings in. But if one wants to broaden the concept of dualism as it is usually applied and take it in a transcendental sense, then neither it nor the pneumatism that is opposed to it on the one side, nor the materialism on the other side have this least ground, since then one's concepts would lack determination, and one would take the difference in the mode of representing objects, which are unknown to us as they are in themselves, for a difference in the things themselves. I represented through inner sense and time, and objects in space outside me are indeed specifically wholly distinct appearances, but they are not thereby thought of as different things. The transcendental object that grounds both outer and inner intuition is neither matter nor thinking being in itself, but rather a known ground of those appearances that supply us with our empirical concepts of the former as well as the latter. So, in short, I think the dualism of empirical objects is sufficient basis for Kant to distinguish himself from a material idealist, if we remember that objects of inner sense are not things in themselves either. Both spheres, objects of inner sense and outer sense, are modes of appearances of an intelligible and known ground. But therefore, it would make no sense for Kant to talk about the possible reducibility of things in themselves to mere representations in the sense of states of a subject of representation. So just to finish, I think this is how the schema here is how we should represent Kant's realism. We have a known ground. And if we think of a non-Kantian idealism, the representation would be something like that. An idealist, in a sense Kant does not accept, would present as possible that perhaps there were no objects of outer sense, or there was not a known ground, and that everything we can be certain of are objects of inner sense. Another way to present the same thing would be to say that perhaps, the problematic idealist would say, perhaps the ground, the absolute ground, are simply objects of inner sense, of which objects of outer sense are merely a manifestation of a ground that in itself it's always being a thinking being, and it's a situation. I think this I think that's the kind of thing that Kant says it's not intelligible. Given transcendental idealism, of course, this is not an intelligible picture, and in that sense, that's why it's so absurd to even present as a possibility that there are only thinking beings and the representation in thinking beings. And so we should stick with here, where we necessarily have, where we cannot even visualize what would be a reducibility of objects of outer sense and ground to objects of inner sense. Okay, thank you very much. I don't know how long, I couldn't see the watch. I don't know how long it took. Thank you very much. I hope it was not too long.
Thank you, Sylvia. It was perfect. We have enough time for questions or commentary or discussions. And I ask to the audience if there are questions, commentary, or I'd
I think,
like,
Georgia, you have to look for who, I'm not that familiar with Zoom, but I think.
I know, I think there is a possibility to give a sign. I have no idea too, but but if something something different appears in my computer, I would know. Question. There is a question from Gunther. Hi, Gunther. Gunther asked, was Kant the idealist realist, a German idealist?
Isn't that difficult? Because, well, I don't know. Thank you very much, Gunther. I know you're traveling. Thank you very much for the question. And there are two reasons why, the connected reasons why I don't know if I can answer well, because I would like to ask you in what sense exactly what you mean a German idealist. So I don't know if I'll make a good answer. And if you're thinking about German idealism, it's a tradition. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying yes or no, because I don't know German idealism as I should. So what I would say, what I would say was perhaps qualify a bit more in which sense I take this idealism to be qualifying what is essentially a realism. Part of it I indicated when I said, well, it's as to form. I don't know what happened afterwards in German idealism, but I think Kant's insistence is that space and time are ideal, and therefore any distinctions we can make among things which depend on space and time, and from a theoretical point of view, those are the only ones we can make. Those distinctions among things are idealist. That is, they are not real. I don't know, Antoine Grandjean, Günther knows him also. He has suggested that I don't know if that's true, because I don't know the context very well, but he tries to approximate Kant's idealism to a refusal of realism about universals. Let's say, I mean, in that sense. And that would also explain why Kant was so shocked to be, by the Feder-Garve review, identified with a different kind of idealism. Because what he was saying was that space and time are not real. In a way, perhaps close to, as we say, universals are not real. And in that sense, he would be about the existence of things, never occurred to him to reduce them to representations except in this transcendental sense, which is a sense of representation very, very different from what we say when we say that all that exists are thinking beings and they are thoughts. So whatever goes in the sense of I don't know if I answer your question, and I really couldn't answer it better because I would have to know German idealism better. And but what I would say, if it goes in any direction that is not of a priority or sufficiency of thought or anything like that, it doesn't seem to me that if Kant had anything in this direction, he would be surprised with the criticism. And so that's the best I could. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Gunther. Gunther says thank you in the messages. I saw that. I'm sorry, I cannot see the reaction here in my board, but Louise helped me, and I know the order. There are questions from Rodica, Karen, Andrew, and Pabella, and Maria Elena. We can start from Rodica, if I say good the name, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rodica. Rodica is my name. Yes, this is an accent in Romanian. Well, thank you for both presentations. And first, for Joel Klein, I am interested in translation from Kant because I'm doing the same into Romanian. It's before the second part of the 20th century, it was nothing, no translation in Brazil.
Actually, none that I know of. There are some translations by Portuguese from Portugal, but
From Portugal.
yeah, maybe, yeah, but
Not satisfactory.
yes,
Maybe.
and yeah, but I don't know. For example, for the first critique, I don't know any knowledge of any translation before the from Valério Roden on Mosburg, and after that from the Francisco Morujão, which was also in the 70s or 80s. So it's quite recent, I would say. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not all the old translation, but as far as I know, there weren't any other.
Oh, okay, but the interest in Kant in Brazil is due to the fact that students from Brazil have studied in Europe, or they raised their interest in Kant in Brazil. And another question is that Brazil is very rich in scientific manifestation on Kant. It was another very good one in Salvador da Bahia, Kant in French, a very good one, connected with Pan-American Congress, maybe 8 years ago. Okay, that is due to internal focus, inner focus, or due to the an external one coming from the from Europe, from German universities, as was the case in Romania.
Okay, I think the first, as far as I know, there was a very strong connection with the French universities, especially at USP. Which started in the 50s and the 60s. And Lebrun stayed more than 3 or 4 years in USP lecturing, and this make a very strong connection. And there are a lot of Brazilian scholars who also take part of the French society, Kant society. So for this reason, at that time, I think it was 15 or 16, there was this French Kant Congress in Salvador too. But this is, I would say, this part was the French influence in the beginning. But after that, from the 70s forward, for example, Valério Roden studied with Dieter Hendrich, for example. Jellico Loparic studied with Heidegger, and those people then they are more strong later with the German universities. And after that, we have a lot of also from Italian people that came to Brazil. Like Georgia is a case of that, but also Alessandro Pinzani. So I would say that there are multiple reasons and origins for this connection with Europe and also the influence. But I will say from the 80s on, there started to develop a kind of microclimate in Brazil studies. So this was an independent concern. And I will say that there's one thing that makes it very important is that the same people that were studying Kant at the time were the main persons that were responsible for building our grad programs in Brazil. So for this reason, Kant was also very important because the same peoples that studied Kant were pushing the frontiers of building our grad system. And then I think there was a very strong connections on and disseminations inside Brazil for at least 20 or 30 years from now, I would say. But this is my impression. I ask also Sylvia that maybe she could help me better to answer your question too.
I see that the influence came from the French culture before the German one. In the case of Brazil. Thank you very much. And I have a question to Sylvia Altman, if possible. Is there a direction of the thinking of the I, concerning the thinking I, from the first critique to prolegomena, to go to the special position of the thinking I in the Metaphysische Anfangsgründe, in the metaphysics of the natural science? This is for Sylvia Altman.
I don't think. Could you repeat? I don't think. I don't.
If there is a movement in Kant's thought, a development in Kant's thought from the first critique concerning the thinking I, the position of the thinking I, because you mentioned the first edition as well as the second, concerning the paralogism, the fourth paralogism. A direction from the critique of pure reason to prolegomeny, to go to prepare the special position of the thinking I in the metaphysics of nature, in metaphysics Metaphysische Anfangsgründe, because they form together the, so to speak, the critical triangle of Kant's thought, of Kant's thinking.
I don't know. I'd have to think of that. I never thought about how. I really wouldn't know what to say about metaphysical foundations of natural science. I will think about it. What I would say, like from the movement, first edition, prolegomena, second edition, I don't see a change. I don't see a movement. I see him making more explicit certain things. In particular, the one I pointed out, the dependence of inner sense on outer sense. But I really wouldn't know what to say about what he does with that next. So I think in the prolegomena, he's surprised to be identified with an idealist, and then he has to address something he did not address directly in the critique in the first edition. But I don't think he changes anything, and I don't think in the second, but I'm really sorry. Thank you for the tip. I'll try to look into what happens later.
The difference is in between prolegomena and the first critica pur, isn't it? Well, because decidedly the metaphysics of natural science is not sustainable. does not support the thinking eye. It's poor integrated in it. So, okay, thank you very much for your presentation.
Just
you,
if I
Ron.
may say a word about your question to Joël, just very, very quickly. I think there were a number of factors. I think this story would have to be traced better. Why we became this microclimate of Kantians? Why Kant is so strong in Brazil? I think there's several factors. There were one of them Joël mentioned, even people who were not exactly Kant scholars, but everybody knew Kant, in part because of this French influence. And people who study Husserl, they studied Kant. People who study Frege studied Kant. People who study Aristotle studied Kant. So for some reason, and then the more people studying it, the more students are doing it, and the more dialogue it is in that. There is this influence of Lebrun, of Grandjean and Lebrun at USP. There is, of course, some influence of the German migration in Brazil. So many people, at least in southern Brazil, German, I think that helped a lot. But it is something that, there was another thing. There was from some seminaries, some people who worked in medieval philosophy, and they studied in Louvain, so they had all this tradition of Jacques Maritain and so on. So I don't know, I can't say more than that, but just that I think it should be studied better, and I think it's many factors. Also, people not in philosophy but in law school studied Kant, so a lot of things converged, but it would be a story to be better told than this. But I think there's many factors.
I see. For this reason, Brazil is very receptive to international conferences online and in presence. I have seen. So, and the government supports them, these efforts, scientific efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Silvia, for the answer. I give the word to Karin. Karin, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have a small question, or maybe two small questions to Joël, primarily about the translation history. And it struck me that the first version of the Critique Pure Reason that was translated into Brazilian Portuguese was the second one. And I wasn't even sure whether the A edition has been fully translated. And so that interests me, because I think that the A edition is the better one. And so it would be a pity if all of you were put on the wrong track by reading the B edition first. And of course, it's interesting because also the Refutation of Idealism is an addition to the second one. So my question is basically: is the focus on the second edition at the cost of the first? And a somewhat related question is the relationship between texts translated into Portuguese by Brazilian authors compared to translations produced by Portuguese authors in Portugal, and whether there are differences in vocabulary or whatever, but also more generally, does it make a difference? Is it a matter of the accessibility of the translations in Brazil, or what exactly is the relationship between the two types of translations? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karin. Actually, I was just taking here because the first translation from the A edition was made by a Portuguese version, which was translated by Manuela Pinto dos Santos and Morujão. I don't know when was the first edition. The 8th edition was in 13. I think it was in the beginning of the 2000s. This Portuguese translation, we have the two editions, the A and B. We have one now translation from the A edition from Fernando Matos that came in this series from Vozes, which I think is for 2015. So in Brazil, only 7 years ago, we have a Brazilian version of the first edition of the VKC. So I can pretty sure say that the second edition is the dominant in the by far in the Brazilian studies. And I don't know why it was Valerio who didn't choose to translate only the second edition. I know that when he dies in 2010, 11, he was working in his version of the first edition, but he didn't manage to finish it. So it was really in 2015 that we have this first edition. And the difference between the Portuguese from Portugal and Brazilian, yeah, I will say that we have now good translations, and from new generations, also from the Leonel Ribeiro dos Santos related some works on Kant. But in my impression, for example, that this from Morujão and Manuela Pinto, that is from the Fundação Caloto de Gulbenkian. I would say that they choose a more readable version of Kant, and not so precise in keeping. So for this reason, Valerio Roden was much more used and studied, because he was a more dry Portuguese, I would say, but it was more connected to the Kant's own text. So and we have a lot of translation by Francisco Morujão, Arthur Mourão from other, but he also was not a Kant scholar. So his translations are also very, I would say, more concerned in to be fluent in the language than to be precise in the use of concepts.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt, but then I'm going to say something that you maybe don't want to say very straightforwardly. Your translations are superior.
I will say that the Brazilian translation now, I would say, now is not the case. I think that, for example, there are very good translations in Portugal, but most of them in Brazil were made by people that were studying Kant. And I don't know if that's the case in Portugal all the time. So especially this Arthur Mourão, for example, he translated a lot, not only Kant, but he never really was a Kant scholar. So this is what I would say that is more, it's a characteristic, I would say, of our tradition that we are.
Yeah,
it's my impression.
And if I can say something about that to complete the answer of Joel, I think that, for example, in the class by teaching Kant, it's better to have a translation in Portuguese of Brazil. They are the same Portuguese of Brazil and the Portuguese of Portugal. They are the same language, but they are very different in the writing. And for I think that the presence of translation in Brazilian Portuguese is very important for the next generation. It's easier for people that learn Kant to learn in the own language, and naturally they understand. All people understand Portuguese of Portugal, but there are many differences, and in a difficult text, easier speak to have access to a difficult text in an easier language, or in your own language, it's really better. Then I think that it is a really important contribution to Kant studies in Brazil, the presence of translations in Brazilian Portuguese. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And about that, there is a question from Luciana. She asked, I read the question, I would like to ask to Professor Klein if the French influence he mentioned in the origin of the Kantian studies in USP is still working. And I would also like, in this case, I would also like if in this case this is similar in other group of Kantian studies in Brazil. Thanks. I think we already spoke about the French influences, but if you want to say something, Joel, about the French influence in the whole Brazil, not just in the USP.
Well, from a long time, USP was our biggest and also the primary center where we have done grad programs and research. So there's this naturally a lot of students that we are now professors at several universities in Brazil were former students at USP. So USP work as a kind of irradiator of this more French tradition of reading Kant. So for this reason, it's very, and I think it's really still very strong, especially this this view of reading very connected with doing history of philosophy, very strong. And of course, there was not always well, the Kantians, they in Brazil, they work together in order to build this Brazilian Kant society, but there are also some tensions between these groups. And one of them is very known about, for example, what the group that Angélico Loparic built in the Unicampus, which they have they found the ground that they own journal, and the Studia Kantiana, for example. So there was also some disputes, and from I would say from the 90s on, because there are several people that make their PhD in Europe. Then they bring more from German also points of view or a way of doing research in Brazil. But I think it's still very, very strong, especially in São Paulo, and universities that receive former students from USP, they are now professors there. So I think it's I will say maybe one typical aspect. It's my impression. I never studied, but so it's saying from one that it's and I don't come from this tradition, so I looking from outside and what is my impression is that they are a lot concerned about issues on politics, on history in Kant. So and the influence of the third critique. So I will say for this reason that there is this article that mentioned by Vinicius Figueiredo, who tracks all these PhD dissertations and master thesis about the third critique. So the third critique has a lot of influence in this view, and also related with Kant's philosophy of history and politics. For example, in Brazil, only in Brazil I know that there are 3 or 4 books only on Kant's philosophy of history, which is very unusually for other traditions, for example. In Brazil, this is very, very in detail studied, for example.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Luciana. The next is Andrew. Andrew, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much to both of you. I found Joel, your talk really fascinating. I mean, it's a lot of work to put together that kind of sociology and history of the way in which Kant studies develops, and I thought it was really helpful. Let me ask a question, though, of Sylvia, and just really wanted to clarify the target. So at the end, you said that the kind of material idealism that Kant might be distinguishing himself from, maybe not so much in the refutation, but just in general, was supposed to be one that alleges that all we have are objects in inner sense and not in outer sense, and also eradicates the external unknown ground. But I guess I was thinking, if Berkeley is supposed to be the representative of this kind of material idealism, which he explicitly says, we certainly there, I mean, the distinction between inner sense and outer sense wouldn't be clear, although he does have things to say about space and time, obviously, and the way in which it could be considered objective. But the most important thing is that he clearly does have an external ground. It's not entirely, I mean, it's not entirely unknown insofar as it's supposed to be God arranging everything in God's omnipotence and benevolence. But the external ground is there. It is a mind, but it's external to all of our minds. So can that really be the kind of material idealism that Kant is targeting, given that Berkeley is so much a part of his picture?
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Andrew, for the question. I won't have a good answer because I've made myself this question many times. How fair, exactly for these reasons. I don't know. I would give provisional answers to try to well, for instance, even if he says, well, we know he says he sees Berkeley as a material idealist. I don't think he's his prime target. I think it's sort of, I would tend to say that it's like, he is his target in the same sense that Descartes is his targets at other points. I mean, he's not specifically answering specific theses, but a general idea. And the general idea would be put in this, that he puts it this: the only things that exist are thinking beings and their determinations. Okay, then you'd say, okay, for Berkeley, okay, it's all thinking beings, it's a mind, but it's not our mind. I think what Kant would say is, you cannot even talk about other minds. You don't know what you're saying when you talk about other minds. Whatever you can talk about, the most Berkeley could justifiably say, according to Kant, is that, well, there's a transcendental ground, which he calls God and says, well, it's a mind. I think it must be so. That's exactly. It's not like he does not have one argument for one specific thesis, but the idea would be very, very general. So in that way, if you look very closely to Jonathan, I see that more clearly in Descartes. At first sight, critiques Kant makes are not fair to Descartes, but in the end, the general idea can address Descartes, and I think perhaps the same point could be made for Berkeley, but then it would have to. I would have to look closer, because exactly I also had this always the same. Let me see. Let me see what happens with Descartes, and I think something analogous could be done with Berkeley. It's like, okay, ultimately, Descartes has an answer for how we are guaranteed that there's extended things, but it depends again of God and the guarantee for clear and distinct ideas. And that's a way of solution Kant would refuse. So I think that with Berkeley, it would happen the same thing. I mean, he would if he would have to show that the general movement he makes would apply to Berkeley too. That he cannot formulate, or general idea would be that he cannot formulate his thesis in terms of only thinking beings and their thoughts. But because of transcendental idealism and because of the way Kant characterizes the access we have to ourselves as an object of inner sense, and then everything else so that's any single argument is against one of them, because he also has to answer that dogmatic idealism, when he's talking about problematic idealism, is not dogmatic idealism. So I don't think you could reconstruct like he's precisely answering that. I think it's more, but I think the critique could be reconstructed as seeing Berkeley as, well, a transcendental realist and therefore an idealist, because it couldn't be otherwise. But
So just so I get
So
it,
it
so
was
the
more.
yeah, so the idea is that the material idealist says that all that exists is minds and the objects of inner sense. And then if Berkeley is a material idealist, he's this sort of illegitimate one who says, yeah, there is an explanation for this in the divine mind and the divine will, but it's Kant's going to say that's illegitimate because he doesn't have the right kinds of arguments for that or something.
Yes, that would be part of it, and also and there is a sense in which I didn't talk about this, but of course I said that when Kant that the characterization of object of outer sense is transcendental inner, I said it is not the basis by which Kant wants to claim himself a realist, but it is an important part. I mean, there's an important part of answering Berkeley, which means that there is a certain immediacy in our access to objects of outer sense. So that there is also that. That also Kant has to answer Descartes, to answer, which says that, well, in spite of certain asymmetry in the access I have to inner sense and outer sense, I have immediate access to objects of outer sense. So and that's a part of the answer I didn't touch, but that is important too. So mainly what I was trying to get the picture was like not so much how much what I presented would help Kant answer Berkeley. I was more interested in saying, how could he claim to be different? How could he claim to be different, even accepting that that we cannot make any distinction among things in themselves? How could he claim to be different if he claims that? So more like how could he distinguish himself, and not so much how he could answer Berkeley.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sylvia and Andrew. And the next in my list is Fabela. Please.
Hi. Yeah, they just got my email address there, so it's
Yes,
Paul.
I suspect that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's Paul Abella. First, I just want to commend Professor Altman for tackling what is a very difficult thing, even to get up on the stage in 30 minutes in terms of thinking about empirical realism and its relationship to transcendental idealism and trying to make sense of that. It's hard to do it in 30 minutes. It's hard to do it in an article, and it's hard to do it in a book. I think sometimes some of the hardest things in trying to get some purchase on Kant's problem and what he's tackling is to kind of answer the question, what's at stake in Kant thinking that he's an empirical realist? And when I read the critique, and here I think I would differ a little bit from Karen, I do think the B edition is Kant's more mature expression of transcendental idealism, given that it was written 7 years after the first, and it was written in the shock of being described as a higher idealist, and arguably in the failure of the Prolegomena, which of course was only really an introduction for students to the first critique, first edition. And I do think in the B edition, there's a sharpening of the themes. It's much more epistemically driven. So it's really that I wanted to ask a question of Professor Altman on. And that was just, I'm wondering where you sort of fit. I mean, there's a kind of tradition in the 20th century in English Kantian scholarship. You've got the wave of people in the 30s, Kemp Smith, Peyton, and others, who are kind of looking at the ontology and the epistemology and maybe giving a balance. And you've got writers in the 50s and 60s and early 70s who are much more ontologically driven. And then you have writers in the 80s who are much more epistemically driven. And then there's a flowering out of other approaches in the 90s and 2000s. I'm kind of wondering where you are on the distinction, and if I'll just take two of those, between a kind of ontological, foregrounded reading of thinking about empirical realism, or whether you think about it more epistemically. And if I can just take 30 seconds to give that a little bit of a sense of what's at stake in that choice. I mean, it's pretty clear that Kant was quite honestly shocked by the higher idealism charge in the Garfer review of 1782. And so what you get, particularly in the B edition, some of it carrying over from the A, his argument that no, there's empirical objects that there and we're not seeing them. The Berkeleian story is dogmatic idealism. The Cartesian story is problematic idealism. They're both forms of empirical idealism, and they are framed in the distinction between empirical idealism and transcendental realism. Read Leibniz. And Kant wants to substitute a different dualism, empirical realism and transcendental idealism. So for empirical objects, regular freeze-dry sized objects that are there when we're not seeing them. They have a history in the past when Homo sapiens sapiens weren't looking at them. And similarly, at the large scale, there's, he says there's stars beyond stars that we're ever even going to observe. Probably in the whole extension of human history, there'll be stars we haven't observed and will never observe, and yet they're still empirically real. So you can see Kant kind of mapping out an empirical realism that is very much tailored to, a sense of in the now, freeze-dried sized objects. He's got a story about objects in the distant past. He's got a story about objects below our sensory threshold conditions. He talks about the reality of magnetic power, even though we can't see it because of the threshold conditions of perception. He talks about faraway stars that exist, even though we'll never get direct observations of them. That's all very much a very robust, rather common sense, but cashed out epistemically, a way of capturing what we mean by realism. And then, of course, Kant has the rejoinder. That's all in the context of the conditions of the possibility of experience, which at the same time are the conditions of the objects of experience. So it exhausts the ontological. And then he even throws on top of that the claim that the proud name of ontology must give way to the modest title of an analytic of principles. So he's really, at least seems to me, he's really driving the epistemic frame of reference. What are the conditions of the possibility of experience, forms of intuition, forms of judgment, a story to be told in terms of experience being a product, an accomplishment. And then he's got the negative story of noumena, which is only a negative concept, particularly in the B edition, which is just a limit. All right, everything, this robust, rich, common sense story about objects below sensory capacities, up in the stars, there when we're not seeing them, all of that is secure, but none of it is an unconditioned description of reality, of which we can know nothing. And that's the domain of morality. So where do you fit when you're thinking about the epistemic and the ontological? Do you put one over the other, or do you have sort of your own view that's something distinct from the two?
Yes, well, as you said, it's a lot in 30 minutes. And I'm never really convinced where I would stand. I would say this. I think an epistemological reading would be too weak. I think Kant wants something a lot stronger because, because of the practical point of view. It has to be from the empirical point of view, from the point of view of knowledge, from the point of view of doing science. Okay, everything is fine. But I think there is let me put it this way. We tend to use the practical point of view as if the philosophy of and we forget that I think the theoretical point of view is also as if. When we are doing science, it's okay if we treat as it all there is this. But there's a fundamental, and then but it's not just a description of how we know. I think there is a stronger sense in which Kant is saying that this is the way we can conceive of the world we know. This is the way we can know it, but we cannot conceive it as if this was not the manifestation of something that in itself cannot be said to be as it manifests to ourselves. And that seems to me a stronger claim than what sometimes people want to call an epistemological claim. But of course, it cannot be an ontology in the sense that, so So I stay in between those two. And I think what he wants is what he calls transcendental, is what he calls his kind of idealism. It is not epistemological in the sense of course, all we can know is what we can of things, is what we can derive of the way in which we can know them. But this is not just a claim about how we know. In a sense, it seems that there is a sort of being there, which has the status of being the way a ground manifests itself to subjects that know what we do. But it's not limited to that, and can be reasonably, intelligibly thought and dealt with by practical reason. So I think it's stronger than I mean. So he's essentially a realist in the sense that he never, as I think, he never doubted that there are other things than thinking beings, and at least as we are thinking. In this sense, he's a realist. But he's an idealist. There is a strong thesis there in this idealism when he says that. I mean, the claim that I think this is a very strong claim that we cannot make any distinction about the grounds of appearances. I think we cannot. We really cannot. I think he means it, that it is possible that the intelligible ground of the stable is the same intelligible ground as mine. I cannot say there are two things, and this does not seem to me a merely epistemological claim. I think it is a very strong, and in this sense ends up being but I don't know, perhaps. So it seems metaphysical, but then on the other hand, I would put it in a different way. If I had to put it in a certain way, I would say that Kant is not so much concerned in making a metaphysics in the sense it's always about how you can make it intelligible, how you can have a rational picture where
I think we just lost her.
Yes. We wait. We wait a few minutes, and
Georgia, do you think we could squeeze in a question for Joel?
yes, eventually, yes. We the next one is Maria Elena. Do you have a question for Joel or Farah that there is in the list? Do you have a question for Joel? We can go on and wait, and then Sylvia start again with the answer.
One of my questions is for Joel, but I believe it's an open-ended question. So I want to ask Joel, you mentioned many times in your responses that something is a good translation, yeah? And yeah, there's a whole philosophy of what it means to talk about a good translation. Yeah, I have stories to tell about my own language, how people invented new terminologies, new glossaries, and they are very disputable ways of translating Kant. So yeah, what in your opinion amounts to a good, convincing translation? Is it just the fluency of the language or faithfulness to the origin, even at the risk of losing the audience? Or yeah, so yeah, how is it in Portuguese?
This is a really hard question. Well, in 2018, there was a colloquium in Florianopolis. One of these I mentioned was exclusively discussing translations on Kant. And the name of the book that came out was Razão Tradutora, a critic of translatory reason. And it was a lot of at that time, Mario Caymmi took part came from Buenos Aires. We have also a lot of discussions in Brazil. Translators that pointed the problems related to translation. So I will say that, of course, there is a lot of room to discuss what is a good or bad translation, but I will say that from a point of view of a scholar or for a researcher, a better translation is the one that tries to keep, for example, be precise in the use of the concepts. For example, not translate and even try to the same concept, same word with different concepts, or for example, try to keep the ambiguities that are present in the original, even if that means building a text that sometimes is harder to understand. So I will say it's for sometimes for the students it's easier to get a translation with make choices, interpretation choices, and keeps the translation clean for students. So it's more easy to read. But we know that some passages or some parts of Kant's text are not so straightforward positions, interpretations. So sometimes there is ambiguities, and to keep these ambiguities in the translation is something that I think it's important for a scholar. And in a more the translation that is more concerned with research than to get the big audience, you know. So in this sense, I mean it a better translation for research. Which one is that one that keeps these ambiguities that are present in the text and not make the decisions for the reader, which for the students is sometimes easier, but I think it camouflages the difficulties. But this is my at that time I took part in this colloquium, and I think this aspect I will say it's was a general consensus in this colloquium. Of course, there are always this. I think it's this quotation that came from Italian. I think traduttore, traditore, something like that. So was, but well, this is my view on the issue. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Maria Elena, thank you, Farad. And Maria Elena?
My question would be for Sylvia.
Okay.
But I also want to thank Joel.
I think she is on the way.
No. Sylvia has returned.
I'm back.
Yes.
Okay. Then
I'm sorry about that. I had to use the phone to. But I didn't want to interrupt. Just I know you went on.
You can starting again to the former to answer the former question. It was very
okay. I don't know exactly how long I talked by myself. No, I'll try to summarize it then, and if something seems missing, you let me know. But so what I was going to say is this: to me, it's not never. I don't intend to have neither understood, much less be convinced what Kant wants to say. But it seems to me that something merely epistemological claim is too weak. On the other hand, he cannot be doing an ontology in the sense that, but what I'm fine with and what I think it's compelling is how that's what I was talking. I don't know how much you got, how you can make a conceivable rational picture of how can we describe, how can we make a whole picture of how we interact with the world. And I think part of that includes, according to him, that it's unintelligible to say that all there are thinking beings like we. And part of it is recognizing that there is an intelligible ground absolutely inaccessible for us from a theoretical point of view. And I think that's stronger than that's very strong and hard to understand. But I think this is interesting, that this I like. But then I cannot see. But well, he says in the foundation of on the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals that we cannot understand how the noumena manifests itself. So I guess that holds for everything. I cannot understand how can we have this phenomena determined by causality, which is the manifestation of something that is not determined by causality. I just can't make the whole picture of it, but just push it. And I don't know, that's the best I could say. And I know I brought a big thing into discussion because, but really there are a whole bunch of things. I made some assumptions explicit, others I didn't make. But basically, my interest was, I mean, to formulate this idea that there is a part of the difference that it makes, the fact that inner sense is an appearance of an unknown ground, and how that makes him distinctively different from any transcendental realist, which he says anyway. That was just
that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And then now Maria Elena can make her question.
Okay. Yes, also I have a question for Sylvia. So I really enjoyed the book. I found very interesting the overall view. There's a small point that I wasn't sure about, and I wanted first to perhaps also a clarificatory question, and I want to ask you whether I got it right, and if yes, then I have a question on that. So at some point you discussed this reflexion, where Kant says that the persistence rests on something simultaneous, and he also speaks of something intelligible. And you said that some people often read this reflexion as evidence that Kant tries to establish the existence of things themselves. This is how I understood it, and you disagree with that. And if I understood that correct, so the question is whether I got that right. And if I got that right, it seemed to me that at some point you said that this Kant speaks of something being simultaneous, and I believe you said that things themselves are not in time, so that's why we would have a problem with thinking that this intelligible would be the thing in itself. Is that right? So it seemed to me that you established a link between things themselves not being in time and talk of simultaneity, and how these things do not go well together. So did you understand that correctly?
I don't know. I know about you. I had trouble. Your voice was very low.
Oh,
I don't know if I got everything. I put on the chat the quote, and then.
Do you want me to repeat it? Can you hear me better now?
So what I'll repeat. I'll try to repeat what I said, and then you can see whether it is perhaps make your question again. What I said is that because Kant says here that the persistent must liegen in what is simultaneous, or in the intelligible, which contains the ground of appearance. So what I'm saying, we could be tempted to say that because he's talking about the ground of appearances, he's making claims about something transcendentally outer. And that's what I was resisting to. So because we could make a move where we say, okay, the persistent cannot be in me, and it cannot be merely in objects in space as phenomena. The simultaneous must be on the ground of appearances, and therefore in something transcendentally outer. You could read it this way, and I was resisting to read it this way, because well, I gave as evidence that we shouldn't read it this way, that I don't think Kant insists so much that we know nothing about the ground of appearances. So say that the ground of appearance is persistent or simultaneous. He couldn't say that. I don't think that would make sense. I don't think so how can we understand this quote? And what I did was, I tried to read that triangle, was say that if we take the triangle we had before, you could not see, like, remember we had like the unknown ground on the basis, and part of it appears as objects of inner sense, part of outer sense. What Kant is saying, that the persistent cannot have come as a manifestation of the objects of inner sense. It must come as a manifestation. So it's not, and that's why I said, well, the thing in itself, as a thing in itself, it cannot be simultaneous or persistent. And so the intelligible ground as an unknown ground of appearance, as a known ground, thought as a thing in itself, cannot be simultaneous. But if we accept a two-aspect view, so to use the label, you could say that the persistent is a manifestation of an intelligible ground. In that sense, the intelligible ground manifests itself persistently as bodies. And so that's the way I was trying to read this, in this sense, that the persistent must rest or liegen in the intelligible ground. It depends on an intelligible ground, which is not, say there is, it's impossible that all there is are thoughts. It's impossible, because from thoughts you would not get the persistent. It could not be a manifestation of thought. It can be a manifestation of something else, which is the intelligible ground, and then we don't know if it's the same, if it's different, or whatever. Then we don't know. So that's, I don't know if that helps.
I think I understood it along these lines during the talk, but that was helpful now that you expanded on it. Now you can hear me, right?
Yes, I know it's much better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry for this. But I was wondering whether one could have an even stronger view and do connect the intelligible and the simultaneity. And I was thinking of some things Kant says, for example, in this essay from 1794, he speaks of eternity having a noumenal duration. So he does seem to entertain the idea that there's a sort of duration that has to do with noumena. So that's one thing. And also even in the B deduction, there is this very interesting passage where he says, just unfortunately I cannot, I will just read a little bit from this. Thus, it's paragraph 23, if one assumes an object of a non-sensible intuition as given, one can certainly represent it through all of the predicates that already lie in the presupposition that nothing belonging to sensible intuition pertains to it, that it is not extended or in space, that its duration is not in time. Again, I find it interesting that it's Kant seems to be open to the idea that we can disentangle the idea of time and duration, and so I was wondering, and what he says also in the deduction, I mean, in the next sentence is that all this, of course, is not, these are just negative characterizations, and that wouldn't amount to cognition. So that's not a cognition in any interesting sense. But still, it seems that you even can have some sort of duration, perhaps simultaneity, in a very different sense in the realm of the intelligible. So this is what I want to say. And then if you do read this reflection against this background, perhaps you could go for a stronger view. That was just, and so I was just wondering to ask you whether you have any comment on that.
Okay, just briefly, yeah. Again, I'll have to think more. I'll use this passage from the B. It seems interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking of what he says, for example, in the end of all things, and how we can represent the end of time. And so I don't know. I'll try. I'll have to think. Thank you for the suggestion. If there is a way in which it's only thought negatively, and I think I would be fine with it, especially because, well, another point is I don't think the intelligible is the transcendentally outer. As sometimes there's so perhaps it could be interesting that the simultaneous. Anyway, your solution would be that there is a sense in which we can, just as we can talk about duration, which is not in time, we could talk about simultaneity or persistence that is not in time. Okay, we have the task of saying what we want to say, what we want to mean with those with those expressions when they are applied to something intelligible or not something sensible. And it would probably be always a negative meaning. And once granted that, we could say that the simultaneous is this sense of simultaneous is in this intelligible, this particular sense of simultaneous. And I don't think that would pose a problem for me, because still it would not count as saying that as it wouldn't pose a problem for me, as long as that does not count as saying that I'm proving the existence of something external to me in a transcendental sense. It would still not, because what is saying to be negatively simultaneous in this sense, it's not exactly the object. It's not it's not something transcendentally other than me, because it's just a ground. Then otherwise, if I could say that it is, that saying that the ground of appearances is simultaneous in whatever sense would be a predicate incompatible with well, it could be incompatible with that of my thoughts. I don't know. Thank you. I'll just think more of the suggestion later. Won't take the time thinking aloud here, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sylvia and Joel. Thank you for the questions. Are there any? Oh, Hala, hi. We don't have any time more for question. I don't know. Perhaps if you want to say something very, very quickly, but perhaps Sylvia and Joel can answer privately, because we must close. Hala.
Absolutely, no problem. Thank you very much, Georgia.
Hi, good to see you. Do we want to say something or any commentary or briefly, very briefly question?
Well, sure, if I may, I'd like to thank Joe for the wonderful lecture, and also Sylvia. If I have a time, I might ask Sylvia about her thesis, namely that I once read Schulze's in his Demons, who represent Kantian as a strong representationalist, and also if you read Richard Rorty's 1979 Philosophy of Mirror of Nature, he also seems to represent Kant as a representationalist of some sort. I was wondering if this reading of Kant is fair to him, if I may ask, from your interpretive point of view, Sylvia. That's all.
Thank you.
Should I answer, or we go to the informal part and then I answer in the informal part? Whatever is best.
You can in 1 minute. You can answer. If you can answer just in 1 minute.
Well, I don't know. It's hard you have to specify more exactly in what sense representationalist, because one way I could put what I was defending was in an obvious, trivial way. I mean, objects of outer sense are representations in one sense, are not representations in another sense. The problem is how you characterize it, this representationalist status. Because if you characterize the representationalist status of objects of outer sense as something that could perhaps be what we would say a mental state, or reducible to the states of a thinking being, then he's not a representationalist. And if you're characterizing representationalists as objects of space are intrinsically represented and are not distinct from each other, not independently of being represented, then he is a representationalist. But then I don't know, you have to see in each case exactly what is being meant by seeing Kant as a representationalist. So I don't know.
That's good for now. Thank you. We're running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah. Then we must close our section. I thank naturally Sylvia, Joel, and all that are here online. And I don't know if Louise or Karin want to say something to close our meeting?
Yeah, okay, Georgia. Thanks for chairing the session, and thanks also all the speakers and participants. I just wanted to mention the next session of the Virtual Kant Congress, which is going to take place on July 29. And the title of the session is Kant Studies in India. So obviously we're going to hear from some of our Indian colleagues. And secondly, I wanted to recall that we'll keep open the Zoom meeting after the end of the formal part. Yeah, so everyone is free to hang on, and I guess that Farhad and maybe Hala can start with their questions there then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye then to next.
Goodbye.